But there's something about Van Gogh's legacy which is much more important than his fathering this or that ism of modern art. Vincent's passionate belief was that people wouldn't just see his pictures, but feel the rush of life in them.
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most trusted voice in true crime. So, we ended off the previous episode looking at Vincent van Gogh basically saying to his brother, look, I'm not going to be chaperoned, I'm not going to be babysat from Saint-Remy to Paris, forget that, don't expect that, that's not going to happen. And now on the 10th of May we get Theo's reply to that fairly stern response, although the rest of his letter was fairly reasonable. And Theo writes, "My dear Vincent, thanks very much for your 2 letters. I'm very happy that the improvement continues, and it would give me great pleasure if you could make the journey without danger. Does it also seem to you that it's such a long time since we saw each other? Since you find it such an annoyance to travel with someone from the asylum, for heaven's sake, you must risk it. Although I'm not like you and wouldn't do it to avoid, should the crisis seize hold of you again, all the miseries that would emerge should you at an unknown station have to deal with people you don't know and who would treat you who knows how." So that's quite a good point from his brother. He's saying, well, what happens if there's a crisis and, couldn't this set you back? I haven't seen you for such a long time, and what happens if something happens, you've got to go back to the asylum and we've got to start from scratch, kind of thing. So he does say, well, maybe you should risk it, but for goodness sake, just don't have another crisis, kind of thing. And can you imagine if you did have a crisis at an unknown station and having to deal with strangers, we don't know how they would treat you. So he goes on to say, now if you leave, send me a telegram without fail so that I know what time you'll be arriving at the Gare de Lyon, and so that I can come and fetch you. Of course you must come to our place if you don't mind making do with a little bedroom where we've put up Vil and several others. So he's also saying, well, you're welcome to stay with us, but it isn't going to be ideal. It's a modest, temporary little place for you to stay. And then he adds, he says, I wrote to Dr. Gogh yesterday to ask him when he's coming to Paris, for he gives consultations then. And at the same time, I asked him to find out about lodgings for you. So Theo's, on behalf of Vincent, contacting Dr. Gogh to say, can you find a place for my brother to stay in Auvers-sur-Oise, right? And Theo goes on to say, yes, the change of region might do you good, but towards winter it's perhaps better that you should be in a warmer climate. But we'll have time to talk about all that. I've written to Dr. Perron to tell him that if there isn't a definite danger, he should do as you wish and let you go. So you kind of get a sense here that the custody of Van Gogh is kind of in the hands of Dr. Perron and his brother. So it's between the two of them that they're going to decide what happens to him. And bear in mind, the money is also coming from his brother. So that is why you kind of have a sense of Van Gogh kind of deferring to his brother, right? He goes on to say, as he's been kind to you, try not to hurt him. So I think that's quite interesting the way he puts it. Basically he's saying, I know you're going to be leaving, just be nice to the guy, something to that effect. He says, I had ordered the colors you asked for from Tanguy and Tassay, telling myself that anyway it wouldn't be lost. If the colors hadn't arrived yet, leave orders for them to be sent on. Will you at last be able to find a place where you can have a little tranquility without having people and things around you that annoy you? So that's really Van Gogh's problem here is, can you find somewhere where you can paint and people and things aren't going to drive you crazy, kind of thing. He says, I hope so with all my heart, and it's possible that in any event this might be an improvement, but people are more or less the same everywhere, and when artistic things preoccupy you, you find very few people who understand you. Ain't that the truth? He goes on to say, it's Latin to them, well, previously I think he said it's Hebrew to them, and they regard it only as a pastime that isn't to be taken seriously. The same kind of applies to writers, I've got to say. Anyway, he goes on to say, I haven't yet been to the salon, which is apparently very mediocre, as they say, but there's an exhibition of Japanese drawings and prints, which you'll see when you come, which is superb. He says, I'd like you to be here already. Don't forget to telegraph me. Warm regards from Joe and the little one. They're both well. Good handshake and au revoir. Theo. And then as a postscript he writes, I'm enclosing 150 francs for the journey. Telegraph me if by chance it isn't enough. So that is really the bottom line. It is up to Theo to give his brother money. Without the money, Vincent can't go anywhere because he's got no money, he's got no job, he's got no vocation, he's got no way of going anywhere. And so this, the enclosing of the 150 francs is the final confirmation of Van Gogh's. It's kind of like the final permission slip, basically his ticket out of the asylum, right? And yeah, 150 francs is a lot of money, bearing in mind it costs about 4 to 5 francs to stay somewhere per day, right? And so 150 francs is 30 times as much as it would be to, say, stay in a hotel somewhere per night. That gives you an idea of the cost of the journey. Okay, and then let's deal with Van Gogh's response, and that came the very next day, Sunday the 11th of May, and he writes, My dear brother, thanks very much for your registered letter containing 150 francs, which arrived this morning. I also received canvases and colours from Tassay and Lotte, were those from Tanguy in the same consignment, and I can't thank you too much for them, for if I didn't have my work, I'd have sunk far deeper long since. At the moment, the improvement is continuing. The whole horrible crisis has disappeared like a thunderstorm, and I'm working here with calm, unremitting ardour to give a last stroke of the brush. I'm working on a canvas of roses on bright green background and 2 canvases of large bouquets of violet irises, one not against a pink background, in which the effect is harmonious and soft through the combination of greens, pinks and violets. So it's kind of like all systems go. He's got his ticket, he's got his paint, and he's kind of feeling very positive. He's giving himself a clean bill of health, and all systems go, right? He says, my dear brother, I feel I have more confidence in my work than when I left, and it would be ungrateful of me to speak ill of the South, and I confess that it's with great sorrow that I turned my back on it. So this is kind of the end of his sojourn in the South. He'd gone to the South to establish a painting colony that had failed, and now he's returning to the North in a way in disgrace, but he's nevertheless saying, wow, I'm sad to be now that I'm leaving, I'm sad to be leaving. And although he has spoken a little bit ill of the people in the South, he's saying he is really sad to be turning his back on that countryside. He says, if your work prevented you from coming to get me at the station, or if it was at a difficult time, or if the weather was too bad, don't worry, I'd certainly find my way. So yeah, he's just trying to be as little of an inconvenience to his brother as he possibly can be. He says, I feel so calm that it would greatly astonish me if I lost my composure. So he's really backing himself that he's now absolutely fine. He's got no anxiety, he's got no problems whatsoever, and he's kind of giving himself a sort of a diagnosis that he's healed, that he's recovered. This is important because it's not as though he's leaving the asylum ragged and unsure. Instead, he's saying, I think I'm fine. I think I'm going to be fine. He says, how much I want to see you again and meet Joe and the baby. He says, it's likely that I'll arrive in Paris around 5 o'clock in the morning. But anyway, the telegram will tell you precisely. The day I leave depends on my having packed my trunk and finished my canvases. I'm working on the latter with so much enthusiasm that packing my trunk seems more difficult to me than doing the paintings. Anyway, it won't be long. I'm very glad that it hasn't dragged on, which is always lamentable when one makes a resolution. I'm very much looking forward to seeing the Japanese prints, and also I don't at all disdain seeing the salon, in which it seems to me that there'll be interesting things all the same. Although having read Le Figaro's account, indeed it leaves me more or less cold. Warm regards, Joe, and a good handshake in thought. Ever yours, Vincent. Okay, and so that's the letter written on Sunday the 11th of May. And then there's a letter to Joseph Ginu, the postman, around about that day or the day after, Monday the 12th. And he writes, my dear Mr. Ginu, this is to ask you to please send by goods train my 2 bed, and goods is emphasized. He says, my 2 beds and the bed linen that are still at your place. That's how poor he is. He's so poor that he sort of probably can't sell his furniture locally, and he doesn't feel like he can sort of buy new furniture somewhere else, and so he wants to transport his meager belongings by goods train to wherever he's going. And that is also, I guess, part of the 150 francs. It's not just to get Van Gogh to where he needs to go, but his furniture. He goes on to say, I think it will be wise to empty the palliaces, for straw will cost as much in transportation charges as it would to buy some new. I think he's talking about the mattresses there and the straw inside them. So he's just saying, look, just empty them out and don't worry about it. He says, the rest of the furniture, my word, there is, for example, the mirror, which I'd very much like to have. He says, you could stick strips of paper onto it to prevent it breaking. So he's quite a high maintenance guy. He's giving Mr. Genu instructions, saying, I want my mirror as well, do this, do that. He says, but the 2 chests of drawers, chairs, table, you can keep them for your trouble. And if there are any additional expenses, you must let me know. So it is possible that the payment might actually come from his other furniture. So he's using some of his furniture to pay for the other furniture, if that makes sense. But if there's any additional expenses, then he's good for it. He says, I very much regret having fallen ill on the day I came to Arles to take my leave of you all. After all, I was ill for 2 months and unable to work. At present, though, I am completely recovered again, and I'm going to return to the north. And so, my dear friends, I shake your hands very firmly in thought, and those of the neighbors, and please believe that up there I'll still think of you all often, for it's true, as Mrs. Genu says, that when people are friends, they are so for a long time. If by chance you should see the Roulans, don't forget to give them my warm regards. So I'll finish this letter hoping that Mrs. Genu is completely recovered from her indisposition, and shaking your hand again. Believe me, ever yours, Vincent. And then he says, please send the beds to Monsieur Van Gogh, Paris, by goods train to be kept at Station Depot. And then he adds a postscript, I'm only planning to stay in Paris for a fortnight at the most, then I'm going to work in the countryside. That's why take good care to put on the address to be kept at Station Depot. Apart from that, if you were to write to me, my address in Paris is 18 Boulevard Montmartre, Maison Boussaint and Co. Probably not pronouncing that right. And that brings us to the last letter. Van Gogh writes from Saint-Remy, and it's to his brother on Tuesday the 13th of May. I think he left 3 days after that. And obviously there was no response from Theo to this particular letter. So this is his final letter, and he says, "My dear brother, after a last discussion with Mr. Peyron, I obtained permission to pack my trunk, which I've sent by goods train. The 30 kilos of luggage one is allowed to take will allow me to take a few frames, easel, and some stretching frames, etc." So think about this situation is you have Van Gogh leaving Saint-Remy, and pretty much his entire wardrobe, all his possessions amounts to less than 30 kilos, and part of that is in taking along his artworks. Now obviously he does have some furniture, basically 2 beds, but that's it, 2 beds and a mirror. That is his wealth. That is the sum total of his wealth. And you know, I lived in South Korea for a while. At one point, I think I traveled there with 2 bicycles in 2 separate boxes, and I had a computer. And there was a time after staying there for 4 or 5 years that I then left South Korea, and I had a lot of stuff. And I remember sending some of it by ship, and it filled up quite a few boxes. There was a lot of clothing. Now think of this guy. He's basically got 30 kilos, and that includes all of his clothes. And one kind of imagines he maybe has 1 or 2 suits and very little else. Maybe 2 or 3 pairs of shoes. That's it. And most of what he's carrying, or a lot of what he's carrying, is his art supplies or his artworks. He goes on to say, "I'll leave as soon as you've written to Mr. Peyron. I feel calm enough, and I don't think that a mental upset could easily happen to me in the state I'm in." So again, he's reassuring his brother. He's saying, now that I'm leaving, I'm calm, I'm good. All things all things are, you know, looking set. I'm feeling ready. Let's get the show on the road. And he says, I don't think I'm going to easily suffer any kind of setback, right? And so again, he's repeatedly giving himself a clean bill of mental health. And this is so important to bear in mind, is that he is the best person to know his condition. And obviously he has a bit of an agenda. He wants to get out of there, and he's just saying, dude, I'm fine, nothing's going to happen to me, let's make sure this happens, kind of thing. And in the other way, it's almost like one gets a sense that, I won't say that he blackmails his brother, but that he sort of says to his brother, you know, if I have to hang around you longer, I'm probably going to be in trouble, kind of thing. I'm probably going to have a crisis. So you kind of get a sense that he's weaponizing his condition in order to get his way. Don't you get that impression? Not in a very ugly, evil, obvious way, but in a little bit of a subtle way, right? He goes on to say, in any event, I hope to be in Paris before Sunday to spend the day, which you will have off quietly with all of you. I really hope to see Andre Bongo too at the first opportunity. I think that's Joe's brother. Okay, so Andre Bongo is Vincent's brother-in-law. He says, I've also just finished a canvas of pink roses against yellow-green background in a green vase. Now one presumes this sort of flurry of artworks of flowers are meant, or the intention behind them is for gifts, as gestures of thanks. And in the next line, Van Gogh says, I hope that the canvases of the last few days will compensate us for the expenses of travel. That's kind of a bit of a far-fetched hope. He's basically saying, you know, I hope that what I painted the last few days will make up for the expense of travel. In other words, what he's saying is, it sounds like he's sending the canvases back to his brother and saying, well, Maybe maybe you can get 150 francs out of this or something like that. Obviously that didn't happen. And what's interesting in the movie At Eternity's Gate, there is a dramatization of Van Gogh arriving in Paris, arriving at his brother's apartment, and then kind of with some dismay seeing the piles and piles and stacks of his canvases everywhere, on the walls, but also behind doors, under beds, lined 3, 4, 5, 6 against each other, against walls, and basically the entire apartment is just filled with his unsold artwork. And you can imagine when you see something like that, you kind of get an idea of the commitment and the kind of self-deprecating suffering that his brother Theo went through to help his brother. I mean, he's literally living with his brother's art all around him, his brother's unsold art. And how many people would want to do that? How many people would want to have your whole family kind of living in the almost like in the storage situation of someone else's unsold art? It's, even if you believe in it, it's something that's going to weigh on you, something that's going to remind you of a not great situation, right? He goes on to say, this morning, as I've been to have my trunk stamped, I saw the countryside again, very fresh after the rain and covered in flowers. How many more things I would have done. I've also written to all for them to send the 2 beds and the bed linen by goods train. I estimate that this can only cost a good 10 francs in transport charges, and it's still something gained from the debacle, for it'll certainly be useful to me in the country. Okay, so that's not that expensive, 10 francs to transport his furniture. He goes on to say, if you haven't yet replied to Mr. Perron's letter, please send him a telegram in such a way that I may make the journey on Friday or Saturday, so that at the latest I can spend Sunday with you. In doing so, I'll also lose the least time for my work, which is finished here for the moment. In Paris, if I feel up to it, I'd immediately very much like to do a painting of a yellow bookshop, gas effect, which I've had in mind for so long. You'll see that I'll be at work right from the day after my arrival. So he's kind of feeling a bit guilty, I guess. He's saying to his brother, bear in mind, in a way he's employed by his brother. In a way he's he paints and he gives his artwork to his brother to sell, which obviously doesn't sell, but he's kind of telling his brother, I'm not going to come and mooch about at your house. I'm gonna be back to work ASAP, right? And he goes on to say, I've had in my mind for so long, you'll see that I'll be at work right from the day after my arrival. I tell you, as regards work, my mind feels absolutely serene, and the brush strokes come to me and follow each other very logically. Anyway, until Sunday at the latest, and he writes this in all caps, Sunday at the latest, I shake your hand firmly in the meantime. Warm regards to Joe, ever yours, Vincent. So this is kind of his last thing of, this is definitely happening, okay? This is on, okay? And you kind of get a sense that he's a little bit anxious, and he's trying to make sure nothing is left to chance. And then he writes this postscript. Probably the answer to Mr. Perron will already have left, which I hope. I was a little vexed that there were a few days delay, because that seems to me to be of no use for anything. For either I'd plunge into new works here, or it's now that I have the leisure for the journey. Spending days doing nothing, here or elsewhere, that's what would make me miserable in my current state of mind. So just saying, I don't want to do nothing. I want to be busy. He goes on to say, besides, Mr. Perron isn't opposed to it, but naturally, when you leave, your position is a little difficult with the rest of the administration. But it's going well, and we'll part amicably. And that's it. That is his last letter from the asylum. His last words are, we'll part amicably, in terms of leaving the asylum. And so the very next letter we'll deal with is the letter he wrote tomorrow, the 20th of May, 130 years ago on that day, from, as I say, from Orves-sur-Loire. And obviously when he wrote that letter, it is within the context of having seen his brother for 2 or 3 days and how he's now settling into Orves, right? And I will at some point take you through my journey to Orves-sur-Loire. I'm just having second thoughts about whether I should continue the month of June and July on YouTube, on the public channel, or whether to shift it to Patreon. There's just not a lot of people watching it on YouTube, so I'm just wondering about that. If you do go to Patreon, for $1 a month, you get access to 567 exclusive posts, including 284 videos, 22 writings, 7 polls, 2 live streams, 133 links, and almost 500 images. Now, that is actually even less than it really is, because often I do writings under images, so you're getting images with quite a lot of writing. The same with links, and the same with videos. There are also audiobooks under the $5 tier, and I do quite a few live interactive discussions, but I don't always post them onto Patreon. But the invitations are made on Patreon, so that's how it works. So just consider that. I would just prefer to do the very high profile stuff occasionally on YouTube, and the stuff that's more niche on Patreon. I'm going to put the photos that I took in Orves-sur-Loire on Patreon. I might put 1 or 2, just like a handful, on YouTube. But I'm going to put the more sort of select stuff on Patreon for people to see. I really found Orves-sur-Loire more beautiful even than Arles, which is saying something. So just also a reminder that my book on Madeleine McCann, Deep into Darkness, is out, is available on Amazon Kindle. The audiobook is available on Patreon for $5. And later on, I think on this channel, I'll probably be putting up an episode on Smithman, just dealing with the Madeleine McCann case. Anyway, until the next episode, stay safe, keep up that social distancing, and I'll see you guys next time.